The anti-gunners are always coming up with new ways to keep you from exercising your Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Have you heard recently about Firearm Owner Identification Cards, or ID cards? Now, I'm not talking about gun permits that allow you to conceal carry in your state. Nope. In several states, you have to actually go through a whole licensing process to get a special ID card before you can even buy a gun. Now, there's some big problems with these ID laws as I see it. How about this for starters? They're probably unconstitutional. But let's get into these details. We'll be come right back. Hey folks, I'm Mark, and welcome to the Four Boxes Diner. Hey, have you gotten your free speech identification card yet? Have you gone down to the DMV and gotten it? Well, if you want to exercise your First Amendment rights to free speech or the exercise of religion or whatnot, hate to break it to you, you're going to have to apply for a government-issued paper card, an ID card first and foremost. You're going to have to fill out the paperwork, and you're going to have to pay a fee to the government to exercise your First Amendment right to free speech. And again, please hold on to any smart, intelligent thoughts you might have about the political process or political candidates or anything associated with your decision to exercise your right to free speech and free expression. I'm kidding, of course. A free speech identification card sounds preposterous, right? Because it's stupid. It's a crazy idea. Who would ever come up with such a crazy idea that you need an ID card to exercise your free speech rights to talk or exercise your political viewpoints? Well, guess what? That's not how rights work, right? We know this. You see, a constitutional right or a right allows you to do something because you're an American, okay? And guess what? The Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms protects an individual right no different than the First Amendment. Right? The Supreme Court has actually said exactly this. So why is it okay for certain states in the United States to require you as a gun owner or potential gun owner to have to get a special government ID, like a driver's license, before you can exercise your constitutional right to keep and bear arms? Well, the answer is it's not okay. It's not acceptable. It's not constitutional, or at least it should not be. Let's take a closer look, folks, as to why these identification laws, as applied to firearm owner identification laws, are unconstitutional. Well, first of all, the Supreme Court of the United States could not be clearer that the Second Amendment protects an individual right that government cannot infringe. The text of your Second Amendment and our American history and traditions support this conclusion, as discussed by the Supreme Court itself in the 2008 case of the District of Columbia versus Heller. The Heller ruling says that the Second Amendment, quote, elevates above all other interests the right of the law-abiding responsible citizens to keep and bear arms, period. So nothing should get in the way of the core protection of the Second Amendment. Now you might be thinking, hey Mark, come on. Even the founders did not think the right to keep and bear arms was unlimited. It was not an unlimited right. Well, okay, that may be true, but the founders did not see the right of free speech as being unlimited either. That's why there are First Amendment exceptions, if you will, to things like libel, defamation, and disclosing government state secrets. So are firearm owner ID laws a reasonable exception to the Second Amendment? Not at all, in my view. The very purpose of these ID laws is to make it harder for law-abiding citizens to own firearms. It's effectively a tax. In the Supreme Court decision in Heller, the court said, quote, constitutional rights are enshrined with the scope they were understood to have when the people adopted them. Sorry, gang, but back when the Second Amendment was ratified in the year 1791, nobody among our founding fathers imagined anything close to firearm owner ID cards. Honestly, there's really nothing like these sorts of things for more than a century after the ratification of the Second Amendment, again, in 1791. You see, after 1900, in the 20th century, some odd laws requiring an ID started to pop up here and there. They were sporadic, though. For example, Washington State required non-citizens to get a license to possess a firearm. And New York State required people to get a license for concealed carry. Those are called the Sullivan Laws that came about in 1911. Now, although these are not ID cards in the strictest sense of the words, these two instances are sort of analogous, as I see it, to firearm owner ID cards in the sense that they required people to get a government license first and foremost in order to possess a firearm. But even these examples do not prohibit the ownership of any firearm absent a government-approved ID card. The founders would not let a firearm owner ID card law stand in any way, shape, or form as I see it. That means that we, in the 21st century, in applying the Second Amendment, should not do so either. Today, several states already do require firearm owner identification cards. So how is it that courts keep upholding this, to me, obvious unconstitutional practice? Well, through a nifty trick that anti-gun lawyers and some judges that don't appear to like guns or the Second Amendment have been using, I want you to listen closely to this. Remember that the Supreme Court's decision in 2008 in Heller, in that decision, it showed that the constitutionality of gun laws turns on what's called the text, the history, and the tradition of the Second Amendment. We call that the text, history, and tradition test, and we've talked about that in other videos on this channel. Well, the anti-gunners push for a different approach, a different test, a different criteria, a different way to figure out whether or not a law violates the Second Amendment. And I'm talking about something that we've discussed on this channel many times before, something I've warned gun owners about. It's called the tiers of scrutiny, or a balancing test. These are extremely bad for gun owners. They're very bad for the Second Amendment. And the reason why anything, whether it be intermediate scrutiny, strict scrutiny, tiers of scrutiny, or balancing test is bad, because it allows judges, unelected judges, to be able to weigh the interest as they see it in us having our right to bear arms under the Second Amendment. They allow them to weigh those interests against the social or the public or the state interest in having gun control. At any time you allow judges to do some sort of a balancing test of the Second Amendment rights against the public rights or the public interest, guess what's going to happen? Most of these anti-gun judges are going to rule against the gun owners. And that's why this criteria of tiers of scrutiny or balancing test is terrible. Again, because in practice, these tiers of scrutiny mean that vague appeals to public safety, just mouthing the words, it's for public safety, gun control is for public safety, okay, it becomes more important than the plain text of the Constitution. Now, never mind that the Supreme Court in Heller specifically rejected this kind of balancing test, these interest balancing tests, which it called judge empowering. You see, the public safety argument is what's winning in a lot of these courts in the United States. So that's why we hope in the Nyserpa versus Bruin case, the balancing tests are going to get thrown out yet again, but we'll see. So again, it is true that many of these statutes involving firearm owner ID cards, okay, have been upheld, but it's only because the standard of review, the criteria that's measured these, has been a tiers of scrutiny test, which again allows judges to balance away their Second Amendment rights against so-called public interest. But do these firearm owner ID laws actually make anybody safer, right? Does it actually advance the ball against, in terms of advancing public safety? Well, and no, the answer is of course they don't. Of course they don't. Why is that? Well, we know the answer, because the anti-gun argument in favor of firearm owner ID laws ignores a fundamental truth that we've talked about many times and you're probably well aware of, and that is criminals do not care about the firearm owner ID process, right? They're criminals. They're criminals, okay? They're murderers and rapists and robbers. They don't care about gun laws. I mean, do we really think that anyone intent on committing crimes with a gun is going to say, hey, wait a minute, I have to fill out this paperwork and get a firearm owner ID card before I can pick up the gun and go out there and commit a crime? Come on, that's just absurd. Of course, criminals are not going to comply with gun laws because they don't comply with any of the other major laws of society, so why would they comply with these administrative gun laws or gun control laws, right? No, just like other gun restrictions, requiring a firearm owner ID card places the burden and the cost and the expense and the headaches on guess whom? It places it on law-abiding citizens only, which is the point of gun control laws, to make it harder for us to exercise a fundamental right to keep and bear arms. So why should you and I be concerned about firearm owner ID laws? I mean, if we're law-abiding, why do we care? Well, again, in my view, they are unconstitutional and they should be illegal. They shouldn't be allowed, right? If you care about protecting your constitutional rights as fundamental, then the mere presence on the books of these laws requiring you to get a government-issued ID before you can exercise your Second Amendment rights should worry you. But you also need to understand the practical effects of these laws. Let's look at the state that to me is most known for these, and that's the state of Illinois. Now, this is the same state that in 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court case of McDonald versus Chicago argued, and again, Chicago argued unsuccessfully in that case before the Supreme Court that the Second Amendment did not apply to the states. It said, well, the Second Amendment only applies to the federal government. It doesn't restrict state or local governments. So Of course, this is the same state that's crazy enough to argue that. So of course we would know that Illinois, that same state, requires firearm owner ID cards because that's a state that's generally bad on guns. Okay? And of course, Illinois has been notorious in this firearms owner ID process for long delays in issuing them to law-abiding citizens and law-abiding applicants. In fact, by 2020, it's my understanding that the state was taking over 6 months to process paperwork, probably using COVID as an excuse for their delays in allowing people to exercise their Second Amendment rights. Even after a backlash forced Illinois to make changes, the ID processing time still takes over a month. Oh, and of course you have to pay the government to get what is, in my opinion, an illegal ID, right? You actually have to talk about insult to injury. You have to pay the government to get this ID. And in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, it actually costs you $100 to get such an ID. Now, surprisingly, Illinois does not gouge you in the same way. They only charge $10 to get this ID. But whether the fee is $1 or $1 million, the reality is it's a tax on law-abiding citizens that want to exercise a fundamental constitutional right. The red tape is a tax on our time. And if you buy a gun in the months that you're waiting for the government to process your paperwork and issue your ID, guess what? You're going to be a criminal. You have to get the ID before you can buy the gun. And if you do it ahead of time, you're a criminal. Makes no sense to me. Now, these ID laws are yet another designed roadblock. On purpose. They exist on purpose. That, to me, the left has put up to make it harder to exercise your Second Amendment rights. And anything they can do to make it harder, more expensive, more time-consuming, more difficult, more of a headache to be able to buy, keep, carry, use a firearm, we know that the anti-gunners want to do it. And firearm owner ID cards are just yet another example of this exact same thing. So let's wrap up. Both the First Amendment's right to free speech and the Second Amendment's right to keep and bear arms protect an individual right. But somehow it appears okay for legislatures and courts to restrict your right to keep and bear arms in ways that would never fly with any of your rights under the First Amendment, including your right to free speech. This is just crazy, right? I mean, actually, in my view, it's unconstitutional what they do to the gun rights in America in many respects, including with firearm owner ID laws. I mean, how do we know this? Well, from the clear text of the Second Amendment and the history of gun restrictions in the founding era. The founding generation did not have anything close to gun control laws associated with firearm owner IDs. But states like Illinois have eaten into Second Amendment rights with what is essentially a tax on American gun owners' time and money in violation, in my view, of the Second Amendment. Firearm owner ID laws should concern you even if you do not live in a state like Illinois that has one of these. And why is that? Because I think it's a symptom of a much bigger problem. It's a symptom of how anti-gunners are always looking for ways to hack away at the Second Amendment and your rights. And many courts in many places are letting them get away with it. Now, it may not be long before the firearm owner ID is no longer an exception, but the rule here in the United States, and that would be bad. And you can bet that more gun restrictions are coming in the name of so-called public safety. Evidence and the plain language of the Constitution be damned. Okay, I hope you learned something, and thanks for joining me here at the Four Boxes Diner, where we serve hot, fresh Second Amendment news and analysis. And if you like what you heard, please subscribe, help us spread the word, and we'll see you again next time at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.